What would you do if the only person who ever believed in you left you nothing but a pair of old shears and a name nobody in town had ever heard? We've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn a river stone in your palm, feeling for its edges, and we think it's time you heard it. Stay close. Her name was Céleste Aumont, and she arrived in the town of Harrow's Reach, Quebec, on a Tuesday in early November, with the kind of quietness that makes people look twice and then look away. She was 22 years old. She had a canvas satchel over one shoulder, a pair of tailor shears in her coat pocket, heavy, black-handled, the blades still sharp despite their age, and approximately $11 to her name. The shears had belonged to her teacher, a woman named Marguerite Bolduc, who had taken Céleste in at 14 after the girl's mother passed, and her uncle had made it clear, without using many words, that there was no room for her in the house he now considered his own. Marguerite had been a seamstress of no small reputation in the village of Saint-Roch des Aulnays, the kind of woman whose work people drove considerable distances to obtain. She had taught Céleste everything: how to read the grain of a fabric the way you read the grain of wood, how to fit a seam to a body rather than a body to a seam, how to hold a needle so your wrists didn't tire by afternoon. She had also taught her how to be still, how to listen, and how to endure the particular ache of being underestimated. Marguerite died in September, quickly and without much warning, a weakness in the heart that she had apparently known about and chosen not to discuss. She left Céleste the shears, a bundle of unfinished orders, and a handwritten note that read, in her cramped, elegant script, "You know more than you think you do. Go somewhere new and trust your hands." There was no money. The house had been rented. The workshop contents barely covered what Marguerite owed the fabric merchant. Céleste finished the outstanding orders out of a sense of obligation she couldn't quite explain. They were not her customers, not her debts. And when the last hem was turned and the last button sewn, she packed the satchel and took the bus north and west until the money in her pocket told her to stop. Harrow's Reach was small in the way that places are small when they have no particular reason to be large. A mill town once, the mill long gone, replaced now by a quiet economy of tradespeople, a few farms at its edges, a general store, a church with a green copper roof, and a diner that doubled as the local post office on Thursday mornings. The main street ran for 4 blocks and ended at a covered bridge over the Harrow River, which was black and cold and moving fast in November. The town sat at the foot of a long ridge of Canadian shield, granite ridges and boreal forest pressing in from the north and west, making the sky feel smaller than it was. It was not a welcoming landscape, exactly, but it was honest about itself, and Céleste had learned to find a particular comfort in that. She found a room above the hardware store, rented from a man named Gérard Clouet, who charged her $65 a month and asked no questions beyond whether she could manage stairs. She could. The room was narrow and cold, with a window that looked out onto the back alley and a cast-iron radiator that hissed and knocked through the night like it was trying to say something. She had one electric burner for cooking, a cot, and a hook on the wall for her coat. It was enough. She had lived in enough places to know that enough was a form of abundance. The town watched her the way small towns watch newcomers. From a slight distance, with careful eyes, they saw a young woman with dark hair and calloused hands who walked with the kind of careful posture that comes from years of bending over a work table. They saw she ate her meals at the diner alone and always ordered the same thing, coffee and whatever soup was on. They saw that she sat in the corner booth and read while she ate, or simply looked out the window at the street with an expression that was not quite sadness and not quite peace. They whispered, "Who is she? Where's she from? What's she doing here?" She was a curiosity for a week, and then she became a fixture, as invisible as the covered bridge or the grain elevator that nobody used anymore. She had gone to the diner on her 3rd day and asked the woman behind the counter. Her name was Annette Tousignant, broad-shouldered and efficient, the kind of person who radiated the particular competence of someone who has been doing one job very well for a long time. Whether she knew of anyone in town who needed alterations done or tailoring work of any kind. Annette had looked at her hands, then at her face, then said she'd ask around. 3 days later, a note had been tucked under the door of Céleste's room. "Come to the church hall Saturday morning, bring your tools." No signature, she went. The church hall smelled of coffee and floor wax, and the specific sweetness of old wood. There were 6 women at folding tables, sorting through a large pile of donated clothing that the parish was gathering for the winter drive. And at the head of the table, overseeing the operation with the brisk authority of a woman who has organized things all her life, was a person who introduced herself as Hortense Beaulieu, the deacon's wife, wearing a cardigan with a button missing, and a look that suggested she was assessing Céleste the way a carpenter assesses a piece of timber, interested but not yet convinced. Hortense gave her the pile. Not work exactly, not paid work. She asked Céleste to look through the donated items and see what could be salvaged, what could be let out or taken in, what was beyond hope. It was a test, and both of them knew it. Céleste sat down and went through it methodically, touching each garment, turning it inside out, reading the wear patterns, the places where fabric had thinned, the seams that had been opened and re-sewn, and opened again by bodies that had grown and shrunk across years. She worked quietly and without hurry, her scissors moving with a precision that she'd inherited from Marguerite, the way some people inherit a way of laughing. The room was quiet except for the sound of the coffee pot and the occasional murmur of the other women. By noon, she had sorted the pile into 3 groups, repaired a split seam in a man's wool coat, and taken in the waist of a dress that had clearly been donated by someone who'd lost a great deal of weight and couldn't quite bear to look at it anymore. Hortense examined the coat seam, ran her thumb along it, and nodded once. "Come back Wednesday," she said. "Bring the shears." The work that followed was not glamorous and it was not well paid, but it was work, and it found her. Word moved the way it does in small towns, which is to say faster than anyone admits and more accurately than anyone expects. A woman needed her daughter's baptism gown let out. A farmer's wife had a coat with a torn lining she'd been meaning to fix for 4 years. A man named Benoit Lacasse, who ran the hardware store below Céleste's room, brought her a pair of work trousers whose zipper had given out in a way that a zipper replacement alone wouldn't fix. The whole front panel had pulled away from the waistband. She fixed it. He brought her 2 more pairs, and then told his neighbor, who told his wife, who told her sister. Céleste worked from the small table in her room, her portable kit spread around her. She earned enough to eat, to keep the room, to buy thread and a few new needles. She did not earn enough to feel settled, but she began to feel, for the first time since September, that she might. That this town, with its cold river and its quiet streets and its careful, watchful people, might hold a shape that she could fit herself into. Not yet, but possibly. It was Hortense Beaulieu who changed things. She arrived at Céleste's door on a Thursday evening in late November, her coat dusted with the first real snow of the season, holding a garment bag over one arm and an expression that occupied the precise middle ground between hesitant and determined. "I need you to look at something," she said, "and I need you to tell me the truth about what you see." Inside the garment bag was a quilt. Not the kind of quilt people hang on walls as decoration. This was a working quilt, the kind made to be used, heavy wool and cotton, the blocks pieced in a traditional pattern Céleste, recognized from Marguerite's old books as bear's paw. But it was old, genuinely old, and as Hortense spread it on the table under the lamp, Céleste understood immediately that it was something else entirely. The fabric in some blocks was unlike anything she had seen outside a museum, silk and velvet, some of it clearly repurposed from much finer garments, interspersed with rougher homespun. The stitching in some sections was extraordinary, tiny and even, and made to last. In others it was coarser, different hands. It had been worked on by more than one person, across what looked like a considerable span of time. Hortense stood with her arms crossed, watching Céleste examine it. "It was in the church attic," she said. "We found it when we were clearing the space last summer. No one knows exactly how old it is. Father Lemaire thinks it's probably late 1800s. There's a paper folded inside the back lining. We didn't take it out. We didn't know if we should." Céleste looked up. "Why are you bringing it to me?" Hortense was quiet for a moment. "Because the women I asked about it had opinions but no knowledge. And because you look at cloth the way people in this town stopped looking at things a long time ago." She paused. "There's also a name stitched into one of the corner blocks. I couldn't read it clearly. I thought you might be able to." Céleste bent low over the quilt, holding it at an angle under the lamp. The stitching in the corner block was faded and in places nearly lost in the fabric, but she could feel it with her fingertip the way you can feel embossed letters on an old book cover. She read it slowly. A. Tousignant, 1889. She asked Hortense to leave it with her, just for a few days, to look more carefully. Hortense agreed, but her expression as she left contained something Céleste couldn't quite name. Attention. A hesitation that went beyond the value of the quilt itself. She did not sleep much that night. She spread the quilt on her cot and sat at the end of it with the lamp tilted close, going through it section by section, the way Marguerite had taught her to examine a garment, not looking for what was there, but for what was different, what didn't fit, what asked a question. The extraordinary stitching in the finer sections suggested a trained hand, someone who had learned their craft seriously and practiced it across years. The name block was in that finer style, but tucked among the cruder sections, the ones that looked like they'd been done by a beginner or someone working quickly. There were small irregularities that caught her eye. 2 blocks where the backing fabric was doubled. 3 places where the batting was thicker than it needed to be for warmth alone. And 1 central block, in deep burgundy wool that had not faded the way the surrounding fabric had, where the stitching on the back described a shape that was not quite a pattern and not quite random. A border of careful, looping stitches, forming a rectangle around a padded center, as deliberate as a door frame. She ran her finger around the stitched rectangle and pressed gently. There was something underneath the batting, something flat and stiff and slightly irregular in shape. Not large, no bigger than a folded letter. She did not open it. She made herself a cup of tea and sat with the quilt in her lap, thinking. She thought about what Marguerite had taught her about discretion, about the difference between seeing and acting, about the fact that things hidden in cloth are hidden there for a reason, and that the reason belongs, first of all, to whoever put them there. She thought about the name stitched in the corner. Annette Tousignant. A woman, probably. Quilts like this were women's work, in 1889. A woman with training, with skills. A woman who had stitched her name into the corner the way a craftsperson signs their work, and then hidden something inside it. The dead keep better ledgers than the living. She hadn't heard those words. That was someone else's story. But she understood what they meant. She went back to Hortense the next morning and told her what she had found. All of it. She did not speculate. She only described what was there, the way Marguerite had taught her to describe a garment before she judged it. Fabric, structure, evidence, question. Hortense listened without expression. When Céleste finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother was a Tousignant, before she married." The paper folded inside the back lining. When they finally took it out together with Céleste's careful seam ripper and the winter light coming through the church hall windows, was not in great condition. But it was legible. It was a deed of property, a parcel of land on the eastern edge of what was now Harrow's Reach, 42 acres of mixed forest and cleared pasture along the river, conveyed by the Diocese of Trois-Rivières to one Augustin Delacroix in 1891. 2 years after the date on the quilt's corner block, there was a notation in the margin, in a handwriting that matched the fine stitching of the quilt. "This land was my grandmother's, taken without cause, given away without right. I put the proof of it here because I had nowhere else." The object hidden inside the padded block was a second document. Older, a title handwritten in French on heavy laid paper, made out in 1872 to one Annette Tousignant, that A for the same parcel of land. It was signed, witnessed, and sealed. It described a woman who had purchased the land with money she had earned herself, over a decade of domestic work in Quebec City, and come north to build something of her own. 19 years later, the land had been transferred to the diocese without her consent, and then to a man named Delacroix, who had no evident connection to it, except that he was the brother-in-law of the bishop. The bishop's name was Évariste Gagnon. His portrait still hung in the church hall. He had a benefactor's plaque under it, and a room in the church rectory bore his name. Hortense looked at the portrait for a long moment. Then she looked at the documents in her hands. Then she looked at Céleste. "How long have you known something was wrong with this town?" Céleste asked quietly. Hortense let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time. "Since I was old enough to notice that some families owned everything, and others apologized for existing," she said. "I just never had any proof of it. What happened next was slower and more complicated than the discovery itself, as these things usually are. The documents were old. Their legal weight in the present was uncertain. Hortense contacted a lawyer, a woman named Sylvie Bedard, who practiced family and property law in Rivière-du-Loup, and who drove up on a Friday morning and spread everything on the church hall table and read it all twice without saying a word. When she finally spoke, she said that the original title was almost certainly valid under the laws of the time. She said that the transfer to the diocese appeared to lack a required instrument of consent. She said that the margin notation and the quilt itself, taken together, constituted a form of historical record that had legal implications in Quebec's property law framework, which treated certain ancestral land claims differently than English common law did. She said it would take time and research and would not be simple. She also said that the Delacroix family had sold the land in 1923 to a man named Etienne Boisvert, who had passed it to his son, who had passed it to his daughter, who was currently the town's deputy mayor, Claudine Boisvert-Renaud. Claudine Boisvert-Renaud was not a villain in the way that some people think of villains. She had not stolen the land. She had inherited a life, a home, a standing in the community, all of which rested on a foundation she had not laid and had no reason to question. But when Hortense came to see her, quietly, with the lawyer's summary in hand and the documents photographed and secured, the first thing Claudine did was not ask questions. The first thing she did was laugh. The way people laugh when they're frightened and don't want to show it, and say that the documents were probably forgeries, the work of a girl who had arrived from nowhere and clearly had her own reasons for stirring up trouble. Céleste was not in the room for this. She heard it secondhand from Hortense, who reported it without embellishment, her voice flat and careful. Céleste sat with it for a day. She had heard that kind of laugh before, the laugh of someone who has been told their entire life that their position is earned and natural, who cannot afford to believe otherwise. She did not take it personally. It still stung, the way cold air stings, but she understood it. What she did not expect was that the story would move without her. She had not told anyone beyond Hortense and the lawyer. But Gérard Clouet, who owned the hardware store, and therefore stood in proximity to a great deal of the town's information, had apparently overheard part of a phone call Hortense made in the store, and by the end of that week, there were murmurs. People began to look at Céleste differently, and not all of it was friendly. The Boisvert family had connections, had cousins, had people who owed them something, or simply liked the world the way it was. The feed store owner told her the price of a spool of thread had gone up. The woman at the post office took longer than necessary to find her parcels. A note appeared under her door that said only, "You don't know what you're getting into." No signature. Céleste found reading it that her hands were steady. She was surprised to discover this about herself. She had thought she might be frightened. She was not frightened. She was tired. Yes. She had been tired since September, the specific exhaustion of a person who has been starting over for longer than they expected. But she was not frightened. She folded the note carefully and put it in the drawer with her needles and thread, and she went back to work. It was the quilt that did it, in the end. Not the documents alone, though the documents mattered, and Sylvie Bedard would spend 6 months in the provincial archives confirming what they said. What moved people, what moved them in the particular way that changes something, was Hortense's decision to bring the quilt to the church hall and lay it out on the long table where everyone could see it. She did not make a speech. She simply put it there, one Sunday after the service, with the documents photographed and mounted beside it, and the name block, A. Tousignant, 1889, at the center, and people came and looked. They brought their coffee. They looked at the stitching. They looked at the photographs of the title from 1872, with its careful French script and its witness signatures. They looked at the margin notation. This land was my grandmother's, taken without cause, given away without right. Old Réjean Morin, who was 81 and had lived in Harrow's Reach his entire life, stood in front of the quilt for a long time and then said, quietly, that his grandmother had told him a story about a woman who had built a house on the eastern ridge before the Boisverts came, a woman people called the Tousignant woman, who had one day simply not been there anymore and whose house had eventually fallen in. He had thought it was just a story. He had not known she had a name. That afternoon, Claudine Boisvert-Renaud came to the church hall herself. She stood at the back of the room for a while, looking at the quilt and the people around it. Céleste was there, sitting in the corner with a cup of tea, as she often was. In the corner, watching, her hands quiet in her lap. Claudine looked at her, finally, and Céleste looked back, without anger, without challenge. Claudine sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I didn't know," Claudine said at last. "I believe you," Céleste said. Another silence. "What do you want?" Claudine asked. And it was a genuine question, the kind that comes after a person has spent 2 weeks defending themselves against something and has finally run out of the energy to keep doing it. Céleste thought about what Marguerite had told her, about the difference between a seam sewn for appearance and a seam sewn to hold, about how the ones made to hold were almost always invisible, about how you could feel them, though if you ran your fingers along the right place. "I want the town to know what happened," she said. "I want Annette Tousignant's name to mean something here, and I want Hortense's family to have what belongs to them." The legal resolution that followed was, as Sylvie Bedard had predicted, long and complicated. The land could not simply be returned. There were decades of title transfers, a house on the property, a family who had genuinely not known the history. But there was a settlement, arrived at through negotiation rather than litigation, in which Hortense's family received a portion of the assessed value of the eastern parcel, and the historical record was formally corrected through a submission to the municipal archive. The church removed Évariste Gagnon's portrait from the hall. They did not replace it with anything. The empty space was, everyone agreed, more honest. On the wall of the church hall, in a simple frame that Gérard Clouet built and donated without anyone asking him to, they hung a photograph of the quilt. Beneath it, a small card in Hortense's handwriting. Made by Annette Tousignant, Harrow's Reach, circa 1889. She made sure someone would remember. Céleste was there for all of this, and then she was there still. Spring came to Harrow's Reach, the way it comes to that part of Quebec, slowly, grudgingly, and then all at once, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first. The river going from black to steel gray to something that caught light. She had taken on more work. Hortense's daughter had asked her to make a dress for her confirmation. The school principal had a collection of winter costumes for the spring play that needed repairing. Gérard Clouet had offered her the use of a better-lit room on the main floor of the hardware store, Monday through Saturday, where she could see clients properly, with space for a dress form and a cutting table. She took it. She painted the walls the color of unbleached linen and set Marguerite's shears on the table by the window where the morning light came in best. The first morning she sat down to work in the new space. She ran her thumb along the blade of the old shears the way she always did, just to feel the edge still there. She had come to this town with $11 and a pair of shears and the habit of making herself invisible, and she had found, not what she was looking for, because she hadn't known what to look for, but something that fit, a seam that held. On the last evening of April, after the shop was closed, Hortense stopped by with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, and a matter-of-fact expression that did not conceal how much she meant by the gesture. They sat in the dim shop, with the lights off, and the spring evening coming through the window, and they talked for a long time about Annette Tousignant, about what it meant to hide something carefully enough that it lasted 100 years, about what a person leaves behind when they leave behind a craft. She knew someone would come along eventually who could read it, Hortense said. Céleste looked at Marguerite's shears on the table, the blade still catching the last of the light. She just had to wait for the right pair of hands, she said. We've been thinking about that ever since. A woman who hid a truth so carefully inside her own work that it took 100 years and a stranger with a needle and a very good eye to find it. And another woman who taught that stranger without knowing what she was preparing her for. If this story stayed with you, leave us a comment. We'd love to know. What would you have done if you'd been the one to find that quilt? Would you have looked closer or put it back? And don't forget to subscribe, because there are always more stories waiting in the places nobody thought to look.